All right, we've got chapter 14, God King, a story in the days of Hezekiah. The chapter is called No Ships in the East. Once out of the city, beyond the reach of the temple guards, they were able to take passage on a boat. It was a freighter, the main boat towing a kind of barge loaded with fruit. They paid in barley. For an extra amount, they were allowed to fit Hermes in a cargo barge. For food, on the evening stopovers, they caught their own fish, cooking them in a little kitchen cabin and eating bread and beans from the sacks. Taharka no longer even thought about the taboos. Jerusalem, the tough little city of Hezekiah, that, said Amos, was their destination. Talos didn't understand why. Why not settle down right here in Egypt? It's as good of a place as any, till things blow over at least. And if they don't, our young hawk here is the true king of the two lands. The men who have risen against him cannot let him go loose. Once Thebes has been searched and searched again, no place in Egypt or Cush will be safe for him. He will live as a fugitive in his own country till he is hunted down. And in Jerusalem he will be safe? After a pause, Amos said, There are different kinds of danger, and to Taharka, my king is a just man, an honorable man. He will help you. You will be king again, young hawk. Neither of you will ever get out of Jerusalem alive, said Talos soberly. I know. That, said Amos, remains to be seen. King again, thought Taharka. He had never wanted to be king, but it had happened. Was it the will of the gods? Surely Shabbataka was not their will. Shabbataka, Shepnuset. The river flowed on between green fields with the endless cliffs of Egypt rising above the river valley. Geese, ducks, ibis, heron. The water was full of boats, sails, and oars, cargo boats and pleasure boats, a yacht with a cabin and its own kitchen boat in tow. Pilgrims on their way to the shrines of Osiris, god of the dead. People, just people. He was one of them now. There were other people too. The people in the banks, the men at the water wheels, endlessly churning the river water into the fields with no reward but what was left over from the tables of the god and his princes. On the dock of a small town where they had tied up for the night, a farmer had been thrown down and was being beaten by a man with the look of an official. Taharka instinctively picked up a stave used for pulling out small boats and balanced it in the palm of his hand, stepping forward and faced the attacker. What's the offense, friend? He jerked his head toward the man on the stones. I don't see a stick in his hands. Don't interfere, said an officious voice from the crowd that had gathered. This is the vizier's tax collector. The man has defaulted on the god's share of the grain. It's a lie, shouted a small boy, his face wet with tears. Our barley is already in the god's granary, and they only left us enough to get through the dry time. Now he wants that too. The tax collector turned on the boy with his cudgel. Taharka sprang forward and deflected the blow. There was a long sigh from the onlookers. 2 men from the granary police came forward, swords drawn. But the crowd was gathering close, and the police did not seem too eager. Taharka was remembering the days of his judgments. He remembered long ago in Napata, the man sentenced to lose his hand. So you want that grain too, he said. For the god? Or for yourself? He wants it for himself. Bloodsucker, my youngest child is crippled from hunger because of him. The crowd was clamoring now. Everyone seemed to have his story. The 3 men were backing away. Now it was Taharka who was advancing, crouching like a panther. You know the punishment for misuse of God's grain, do you not? He felt Amos's hand on his shoulder, heard him whisper in his ear. Easy, Hawk, watch your tongue. The tax collector decided to give it up. He and his guards had a hard time getting back through the crowd. They heard him shouting, This will be reported! The god is not to be defied! You'll hear from us! We won't, muttered Amos, but it would be wise to stay out of sight here, back on the boat till morning. As they ate their bread beneath the passengers' awnings, Talos said sadly, "You're right. Egypt is not safe for our hawk. There is no way he is going to be able to keep himself hidden." Taharka was not hungry. "How can these things happen? Who are the men who lets these things happen?" "A king would find out," said Amos. "I wonder if Shabataka would concern himself." Tanis, the great city of the delta, so close to the vast sea of the north, Taharka thought he could smell the salt. The delta itself was a strange and wonderful world to him. The little fingers of the Nile spreading out and reaching to the sea, the swamps and marshes, the tall reeds and the papyrus, the little boats of the fowlers, the great green plain around the city. Amos gazed around him with a strange, almost a remembering look. "It was here," he said, "that my people settled when my father Jacob led them from the east. It was here that they were held captive by Pharaoh till Moses the prince led them out of slavery. But at Tanis there was bad news. There were no seagoing ships, no Byblos travelers tied up at the docks." Amos questioned the foreman of the dock workers. "No sea travel now to the east," said the man. "Nothing till who knows when. Business is going to be very bad." "Why not? What has happened?" But Amos looked as though he already knew the answer. "A caravan came in 3 days ago. There's a war going on. Very heavy fighting in the cities on the eastern coast." Amos closed his eyes. "It has begun." The man looked at them curiously. "Why are you so anxious to get into it?" "It's my home," said Amos. "Theirs too?" said the man, looking from Talos to Taharka. He seemed suspicious. "Come," said Amos, and drew the other two away from the foreman. He whispered to Taharka, "We must get away. Even this man wonders about us, and it won't be long before patrols are posted at the borders." "What can we do?" "Hey!" The foreman was calling after them. They stopped, uncertain what it meant. But the man was not unfriendly. "That caravan, they're as crazy as you are. They're going back. Well, we will all have to earn a living." Amos waved his thanks to the foreman. "It's our only chance," he whispered. They discovered that the caravan had been gathered from a Bedouin tribe known as the Mukri, who had long had close ties to Egypt. They were among the very few who now made the regular crossing across the old desert trade route from Gaza to the Egyptian frontier. They were real desert people, the first Taharka had ever seen, lean and brown and bearded, like bright birds of prey in their big striped robes and the headwear that protected them from the sun. The caravan itself, camped outside the city, was like a small army. A circle of black tents guarded the animals that provided them with food and clothing. Inside the circle, the women and children went about their business, milking the goats, shaping the leather jars that formed a large part of their trade, cooking up the mutton in their big stew pots. Outside rode the armed men who guarded the camps, always watchful, for in times like these you never knew. They had horses and donkeys and camels. Taharka had heard of these creatures, huge and humped and ugly, traveling in the desert for days without food or water. He stared at them, fascinated. What we in Kush could do with camels, he thought. We could move out west of the river, build cities in the desert as far as the coast of their boundless western sea, where they say the rivers run with gold. "Stay away from them," Amos was saying. "They're mean beasts." The chief of the clan received them in his tent. They sat cross-legged in cushions, and their hearts sinking watched him slowly shake his head. "We can take no one else. You have never crossed the desert before. Then you cannot know how needful it is that we conserve our supplies. You haven't enough to sustain you. What you offer in payment is no good to us. We have our own trade goods. No, you must find another way. Or stay here and be safe. Things are bad in the east, though," he added pompously. "We of the Mukri have no fear of the Assyrians." There was an odd sound from Talos, like smothered sneeze. There was another sound, too, from a curtained section of the big tent. A child was crying, a fretful, wailing cry. The chief turned his head, his face suddenly tense and anxious. "Someone is sick?" "It's nothing," said the chief. "We have our little ailments. My son is strong, a Mukri boy. He will be able to travel." "He's crying from pain," said Taharka. The little boy is suffering. Maybe I can help. The chief looked doubtful, and Taharka, a little carried away, added, I am a physician. Amos said hastily, he was assistant to a physician in Thebes. Thebes? The chief was impressed. You may look at him if you like. The child lay on a pile of brightly dyed sheepskins, turned his head restlessly from side to side. Taharka laid his hand on the boy's forehead. It was very hot. Looking up at the tall black boy, not so very much older than he was, the child quieted a little. Taharka turned the curly head to one side. The skin around the ear was red and swollen. He looked beneath. A boil. A very large boil. Taharka let out his breath in a long sigh. I think I know what to do. Talos muttered in his ear, Are you crazy? What if something happens to him? What if they blame us? I'll need figs chopped very fine, and a grain mash and hot water. The ingredients were brought. Taharka set to work mixing a poultice. You really know what you're doing. Wait, you really know what you're doing? Amos whispered nervously. Well, actually, I only saw Baku use it on an animal. But if it could cure a horse, why not a human? Besides, the little boy is in pain. Someone has to do something. I will pray, said Amos. He went outside and covered his head. Very carefully, Taharka applied the poultice to the boil. The boy cried out at once at the hot water, then at Taharka's soothing touch. He lay still. The chief followed the young physician into the outer tent. Taharka began his instructions as to how to apply the medicine. We will not be doing this, said the chief. You will. You will stay here till I see for myself what comes of it all. His voice was menacing. His eyes were as hard as stone. You see, whispered Talos, what did I tell you? It will be a long day before I see home again. In any case, it was a long night. The little boy was restless. Taharka changed the poultice often and sat by the sheepskin bed to watch his progress. Once, to soothe him to sleep, he told him a story, the story of a prince who had rescued a slave from a fabulous monster. Finally, he fell asleep himself. He woke to find the sheepskin empty. Frightened, he pushed back the curtains. The outer tent was empty too, but in the open, the air was full of a great commotion. Sheep bleating, donkeys, braying horses, neighing, the shrill chatter of children, the shouted commands of soldiers and camel drivers. The caravan was pulling up stakes, folding its tents, ready to go. Bewildered, Taharka stood in the flap of the chief's tent, the soft wind of the delta ruffling his cotton cloak. He heard Amos shouting, Get your things together. They've taken us on. We're moving out. A little boy in a brilliant red and blue robe ran to him and threw his arms around his waist. You can travel with me. You can be my doctor and tell me stories. You're well? Taharka couldn't believe it. Had he done this? Yes, said Amos. One way or the other, our patient recovered during the night. Look at him run. The father is full of gratitude, says we can share in their meat and their water all the way to Gaza. He paused, looking at Taharka with respect. I owe you my thanks, Haru. Save your thanks, said Talos. See if he deserves it when you get to Jerusalem. If you get to Jerusalem. It was as if the breeze had suddenly turned cold. We? Said Amos. You're not coming with us? Talos shook his head. I have seen the Assyrians. I will not see them again. And I tell you, Amos, it would be better for you to go alone into the desert of the west without water than to go where you are going. After a long pause, Taharka said, What will you do? Settle down a while in Tanis, said Talos. It's a pleasant town. I have enough left to make a start. I make you a present. Hermes, to carry your burdens. No, you will need him. He looked around him. What in the world? These cities on the Nile? Your columns, your carvings in stone? Your sciences, your medicines? We are like children there. He gestured northward, across the sea. But we will learn. He laid his hands on Taharka's shoulders. I will miss you, Great One. I am happy to have been of help to you. I am sorry for what lies ahead. He sighed. You were learning to live in this world. You have made a physician. You'd have made a good man. He will make a good king, said Amos softly. Little knots of the people of Tanis, idlers, the inquisitive people looking for last-minute bargains, had gathered on the outskirts of the Bedouin encampment. They watched in curiosity as the caravan moved out. Looking back, Taharka saw a man step out from the crowd. He saw him raise his hands in a gesture of farewell. He thought his eyes were playing tricks with him. It was the man he had collided with in the street. It was the man with the scar.